I was shocked. I started crying. I mean, it stunned me. I didn't know how it could happen. I don't know why it would happen.
That's exactly how 17-year-old Jeff reacted when he discovered that 4 members of his family were brutally murdered on the night of his prom. This case is one of those that'll have you second-guessing everything. Seriously, everything. From the cops to the detectives, the prosecution team, and even the judge. To this day, many people still can't believe he's guilty, and by the time you finish this video, you might just be left asking the same question that's haunted everyone who's followed this story. What really happened? Lakeville, Indiana, a tiny town with fewer than 900 people. Jeff and his family weren't ordinary folks in this town. They were well known and played a significant role in the community. But Jeff and his family didn't start their story there. Jeff, whose full name is Robert Jeffrey Pelley, was born on December 10, 1971, in Florence, Kentucky, to his parents Robert and Eva Pelley. As his name suggests, Jeff was named after his father. A few years later, Jeff became an older brother when the family welcomed a second child, a daughter named Jacques. In 1980, when Jeff was 9 years old, the Pelley family packed their bags and moved to Cape Coral, Florida. The reason for the move was a new job opportunity for Bob, Jeff's father, who had secured a position in computer programming at Landmark Bank. Now, Jeff and Jacques were raised in a religious household where going to church was a non-negotiable part of life. Bob, their father, was deeply committed to his faith and strict when it came to discipline. Crying wasn't allowed, as Bob believed it was a sign of weakness, a lesson he carried over from his own upbringing. However, the kids found comfort in their mother, Eva, who provided them with a space to show their emotions. But life took a heartbreaking turn in February 1985 when Eva passed away from skin cancer. She had refused treatment and her health rapidly declined, eventually leaving her in a coma. For Jeff and Jacques, losing their mother was devastating and their family's dynamic was forever changed. This was evident just a few months after Eva's death when Bob met a 27-year-old woman named Dawn Huber. Dawn had also experienced loss, having recently lost her significant other. The two were introduced through Bob's cousin, Katie, who was also Dawn's best friend. Their connection was quick, and within 9 months of Eva's passing, Bob and Dawn married in a small church ceremony in Ohio. However, this union wasn't exactly a happy occasion for everyone. Jeff and Jacques weren't even invited to the wedding, although Dawn's 3 daughters, 5-year-old Jessica, 4-year-old Janelle, and 2-year-old Jolene, were present. By 1986, the newly blended family made a fresh start in the tiny town of Lakeville, Indiana. Bob believed he had been called to ministry and accepted a position at the Olive Branch United Brethren Church. This was no mega church. It was a humble congregation of just 40 to 50 members. The job offered a modest salary of $1,300 a month, which, when adjusted for inflation, would be about $3,700 to $4,000 per month in today's money. What made the deal sweeter was the free housing, a parsonage provided by the church, situated conveniently right across the street. After moving, Jeff began attending LaVille Junior Senior High School, where he quickly became well-liked by his peers. He also got a part-time job at McDonald's, further cementing his place in the community. Around this time, he started dating a girl named Darla, and from the outside, it seemed like life was finally settling down for the Pelleys in their new town. However, just like any true crime story, life has also a way of taking a shocking turn when you least expect it. A few years later, something unimaginable happened that would forever change the Pelley family's story. On Sunday, April 30th, 1989, Dave, a member of the Olive Branch United Brethren Church, was responsible for making sure everyone showed up for the service on time. At around 9:15 in the morning, he noticed something unusual. Pastor Bob and his family were nowhere to be found. Bob, who ran the church, was always there before 9. This was highly out of character for him. Around the same time, an 11-year-old girl named Stephanie, who was friends with the Pelley children, went over to the family's parsonage. This was a regular Sunday routine for her, but when she got to the back door of the garage, she was surprised to find it locked. Thinking something was odd, she tried the sliding glass door at the back, but that was locked too. Confused, Stephanie ran back to the church, thinking she had simply missed them. She told her father, Henry, about what happened, and together with Dave, they started wondering if the Pelley family might have just overslept. By 9:30, Dave asked a young church member to step in and lead the service while he tried to figure out where Pastor Bob was. He walked over to the Pelley's parsonage and knocked on both the front and back doors, but there was no answer. All the blinds were drawn and the curtains were shut tight, leaving Dave unable to see anything inside. Feeling uneasy, he returned to the church and sat in the back row, but something didn't sit right with him. Minutes later, he and another church member decided to try a spare key to gain access to the house. Unfortunately, the key didn't fit. Just then, Lydia Easterday, another church member, saw them struggling and offered them another key, one belonging to her husband, a staff member of the church. Dave tried the back door first, but it didn't work. He then moved to the front door, and to his relief, the key turned. And what he saw in that hallway would haunt him forever. The first thing he noticed was Bob's eyeglasses lying on the carpet. As he stepped closer to the glasses, he looked to his left and froze. There, on the floor, was Bob, face down in a pool of blood. Panic set in. Dave rushed to the back door, letting the other church members inside. He told them to call 911 immediately. As he continued to survey the house, he spotted the stairs leading down to the basement. He peered down and saw two small feet clad in white socks. His heart sank. He knew it was one of the children. The dim lighting made it hard to see, but the unmistakable feeling of dread overtook him. Soon, paramedics arrived. Dave quickly told them not to touch anything as he suspected a murder had taken place. They turned on the light, and the scene would soon reveal a chilling truth.
The Sunday after prom night in April 1989, parishioners with Lakeville's Olive Branch Church found their minister and his family dead on the floor of the church parsonage. Reverend Robert Pelley was found with 2 bullet holes in his body. His wife Dawn was found entwined with the bodies of her 2 young daughters, Janelle, 8, and Jolene, 6.
This tragedy was truly horrific, and as you might recall, there were 7 members of the Pelley family, so with 4 of them found dead, the search for the remaining 3 children was on. It turns out, though, that 3 of the children weren't even home that morning. Jessica, the 9-year-old daughter of Dawn, had spent the night at a friend's house. When her friend's mother drove her back to the parsonage that morning, they arrived to see yellow caution tape surrounding their home. Jessica immediately sensed something was terribly wrong, and her worst fears were confirmed when she learned what had happened to her family. But there was still the question of where Pastor Bob's other 2 children were. Jacques, aged 14, was about an hour and a half away at Huntington College, visiting friends from a church camp. The situation surrounding Jacques' return was strange. A bishop from their church came to pick her up, but he didn't tell her anything about the tragedy that had just unfolded at home. Jacques was completely blindsided when she arrived home and learned of the devastating news. Jeff, the 17-year-old son of Pastor Bob, was also nowhere to be found. Detectives later learned he had been at Six Flags Great America, a theme park in Gurnee, Illinois. They pieced this together from Jessica, who mentioned it during the investigation. Now, tracking Jeff down wasn't as difficult as it seemed, though. He and his girlfriend, Darla, along with a group of friends, had spent the day at the park. While standing in line for a ride, Jeff started to feel something wasn't quite right. It was a nagging sensation, one that he couldn't explain, but he couldn't shake it. He turned to Darla and confided in her, saying he thought something bad had happened, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Darla tried to dismiss his concerns, but Jeff's uneasy feeling only grew stronger. Before long, the police arrived at Six Flags, and they separated Jeff and Darla from their friends. They began to interview everyone about Jeff's whereabouts the night before, trying to piece together his movements. Jeff was interrogated right after this with his grandparents, and there's actually a clip of him being questioned.
Was there anybody in the family you really didn't get along with? How about your stepmother?
We didn't get along real well. I mean, we talked hi, bye type thing, but we never really talked to each other or anything. I mean, I didn't hate her or anything, but we tolerated each other.
And how about your stepsisters?
Which ones? All three of them? What about them?
Did you get along with them?
Oh, I get along with the girls great. I just love the girls.
Did you and your dad get in any arguments Saturday?
No, we had a real good day Saturday. We got along real well.
What do you mean you and your dad had a real good day?
Saturday we didn't argue at all. He was really, he said that I'd been doing a pretty good job of shaping up and everything.
So do you know who killed your mother and father? Or your father and...
No, I really don't. I don't know who would want to.
Did you have anything to do with it?
No, I didn't. No, I didn't. Me and my father didn't get along sometimes. And sometimes I'd be really upset with him. But we always worked things out.
As you can tell from the clip, the tension in the air was palpable. Right from the start, the police were cautious around Jeff, and their suspicion was undeniable. It was clear to them that something wasn't adding up, and they began to focus their attention on him. The reason for their suspicion? According to the investigators, Jeff's relationship with his family was anything but simple. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. As it turns out, when Bob and Dawn married, Bob had hoped that Jeff and Jacques, his children from his first marriage, would accept Dawn as their new mother. But that was a lot to ask, especially since their real mother had passed away less than a year earlier. For Jeff and Jacques, moving on from their mother was impossible. They couldn't just forget her, and that resistance created a rift in the family that would only deepen over time. To make matters worse, Jeff and Jacques didn't agree with the way Dawn was raising her daughters. The differences in parenting styles caused friction at home, and Jeff, in particular, was growing more distant from his father and the new family dynamics. According to their neighbors, Jeff had become something of an outcast within his own family. He didn't fit in, and it seemed like he was always on the outside looking in. But that wasn't all. 6 weeks before the tragic events, Jeff found himself in serious trouble. He was arrested for stealing CDs and cash from a neighbor named John. The crime itself was bad enough, but the aftermath was even more telling. John chose not to press charges, but instead they worked out a deal. This, however, didn't sit well with Bob. His anger was palpable, and as a form of punishment, Bob decided that Jeff wouldn't be allowed to attend prom. That was a big deal for a 17-year-old, and it was a blow to Jeff's social life. Bob didn't stop there. He openly shared Jeff's behavior problems with others at church, further isolating Jeff from the rest of the community. It was clear that Bob was frustrated with his son, and this tension only seemed to escalate. To add insult to injury, Bob even took matters into his own hands by removing some of Jeff's belongings from his car, including his car keys. The car in question was a 1984 silver Ford Mustang, a flashy, attention-grabbing vehicle that was hard to miss. By taking the keys, Bob essentially grounded Jeff, restricting his freedom even more. With all these factors at play, the police's suspicion of Jeff only grew stronger. They couldn't help but wonder if his frustration and anger had led him to do something unforgivable. And after that tense interview, they began to focus their attention entirely on him, trying to find any clue that would tie him to the crime. But here's where things start to get tricky. There are a lot of discrepancies and oddities in this case that really make you question whether Jeff was actually involved. Let's start with the first major contradiction. Jeff wasn't originally allowed to attend prom, a decision Bob had made as punishment for his previous transgressions. But then, surprisingly, Bob had a change of heart and allowed Jeff to go. According to both Jeff and his sister Jock, Bob could be harsh when doling out punishments. However, once Bob had cooled down, he would often reduce the severity of his punishments, and this instance was no different. Jeff's prom night was not a typical rebellious teenager's outing, though, and that's where things began to get murky. At the crime scene, detectives discovered some curious items. Among the usual evidence, things like carpet fibers, walls, and bullet fragments, was something far more intriguing. A set of keys was found in a trash barrel outside the house, but it wasn't just any set of keys. Attached to them was a heart-shaped locket, and inside the locket was a photo of a man and a woman. Strangely, the investigators paid little attention to this, and they didn't even photograph the item for evidence. What could this locket mean? Who were the people in the photo? These questions were left unanswered, adding to the growing list of oddities. Other peculiarities emerged as well. On Jeff's bed, they discovered a photo book filled with pictures of his life from the first 7 years. At first, this seemed like a normal childhood album, but as time went on, it became an odd clue. It was as though Jeff had been looking back on his early memories, particularly when his mom was still alive and his dad wasn't remarried. Could this have stirred up intense emotions that led to the violence? The police also found a load of laundry in the house, freshly washed that same day, and it only contained Jeff's clothes. This raised suspicions. Was Jeff trying to cover up something? Some speculated that he might have been revisiting his memories when he lost control, perhaps in a fit of rage, and murdered his family before quickly cleaning up. But there was something much more puzzling that wasn't found at the crime scene. Despite the brutal killings, there was no sign of the weapon that caused all the destruction. There was no 20-gauge shotgun, no shell casings, and no indication of where the weapon had gone. The Pelley family had indeed owned a Mossberg 520-gauge shotgun, which Bob had purchased in December 1987. Bob traded a .44 caliber handgun and $90 to acquire the gun, which he had planned to give Jeff as a Christmas gift. But by the time the authorities arrived at the scene, the shotgun was missing. Even more strange was the fact that it wasn't included in the list of evidence, and no one could explain where it had gone. Keep this in mind, because this missing gun would become a key detail in the mystery later on. And to understand the timeline better, let's rewind to the day before the murders, on April 29, 1989. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Jeff worked a morning shift at McDonald's, and later that day, his father, Bob, stopped by a gun store owned by Steve Diller. Bob didn't buy anything, but he spent some time talking with the owner. Afterward, he picked Jeff up from work, and they headed home to the parsonage. It was well known that Bob had recently picked up a hobby, photography. On that particular day, he had scheduled a photo session with several couples, a task he was excited about. Eyewitness accounts would later place Bob at the parsonage before the tragic events unfolded. The window of time in which the family was likely killed was incredibly short, only about 15 minutes, between 5:10 and 5:25 in the evening. A couple, Kim and David, were some of the last people to see the family alive. They had just finished taking photos with Bob and were leaving the house around 5 o'clock. Another man, Matt Miller, drove by the parsonage at 5:15 and noticed Jeff's Mustang still parked in the driveway. However, when Kim and David passed by again at 5:30, the scene had dramatically changed. Jeff's car was gone, and the family was nowhere to be seen. Meanwhile, another couple, Crystal and her date, had a scheduled photo session with Bob and his daughters at Crystal's house. But when Bob and the girls didn't show up at the agreed time, Crystal grew concerned. She decided to go over to the parsonage herself. When she arrived with her date, they knocked on the doors, but no one answered. All the cars were parked in the driveway, except for Jeff's Mustang, which was missing. Based on these accounts, it seemed clear that Jeff's car was gone by 5:30 p.m., which would have been after the murders had occurred. However, some eyewitness accounts didn't quite match up. Kurt Schaefer, a friend of Jeff's, and his cousin Ken saw Jeff leave the parsonage between 4:45 and 5 o'clock. Kurt even recognized the distinct sound of Jeff's Mustang. Lewis, another neighbor, also saw Bob around 5 o'clock, talking to a man in a black pickup truck. Bob was holding a shovel, and although Lewis waved at him, he seemed distracted. Who was this man in the black truck? No one knew. But perhaps the most crucial sighting came from Dennis, a gas station clerk. Dennis was working at an Amoco station just 6 minutes from the parsonage. At 5:17 in the evening, he saw Jeff pull in with his Mustang. Jeff was under the hood of his car, wearing a black Hawaiian shirt and blue jeans. Dennis remembered the time clearly because his shift was supposed to end at 5, but his replacement was late. At 5:20, Jeff entered the store and used the phone to call his girlfriend, Darla. He told her his car was idling too high and that he was running late. After the call, Jeff returned outside to continue working on the car. By 5:37, Jeff left the gas station and Dennis clocked out for the day. From these accounts, if the Pelley family was indeed murdered between 5:10 and 5:25 p.m., it seemed clear that Jeff had no involvement. Moving on, Jeff later went to his friend Lynette Greer's house around 5:45 p.m., a visit confirmed by his girlfriend Darla. The two, along with Lynette and her date, went to the Emporium restaurant at 6:15 p.m. to meet more friends. At the restaurant, everyone said Jeff appeared perfectly normal, chatting, laughing, and enjoying the evening like any teenager. Later that night, Jeff attended prom and afterward went bowling. Witnesses at both events described him as calm and collected, seemingly unaffected by the horrific events that had occurred just hours before, if he were indeed involved. He spent the night at a friend's house and went to Six Flags the next morning, carrying on as though nothing had happened. The police questioned everyone who had been with him that day, but no evidence connected him to the murders. His whereabouts were accounted for, and no clues tied him to the crime. As a result, the case went cold, and attention shifted away from Jeff. Over the years, the surviving children, including Jeff, grew up. He and his girlfriend went off to college, while his sisters went to live with their grandparents and in foster care. Unfortunately, Jeff's relationship didn't work out, and he eventually moved back to Lakeville. However, his return to his hometown was anything but easy. Since the murders, most people still viewed him with suspicion, pointing fingers at him as the prime suspect. The constant whispers and judgment weighed heavily on him, and as a result, Jeff decided to leave Lakeville behind for a fresh start. Seeking a new beginning, Jeff relocated to Fort Myers, Florida, where he started working in the credit bureau business owned by a longtime family friend, Philip Hawley. The Hawley family welcomed him as one of their own, and Jeff eventually married Philip's niece, Kim. It seemed like life was moving forward for Jeff, and for a while, things appeared to settle down. However, the shadow of the past was never far behind. Years after the tragic deaths of his family, Jeff and his sisters were each left inheritance money from their parents' estate. Jeff was set to inherit $48,000, while his sisters would receive $65,000 each. But there was a catch. They couldn't access the funds until they turned 23. Desperate for the money, Jeff became fixated on getting his hands on it sooner, and he came up with a plan. He told a story about having skin cancer and needing surgery. To make it seem real, he even forged medical papers. But his plan didn't work. The names on the documents didn't match the hospital staff, and it became clear he was lying. The FBI, who had been investigating the Pelley family case, got involved. They tracked Jeff down for trying to deceive them. In the end, Jeff was charged with wire fraud. He didn't go to prison, but he was sentenced to probation. The charge was a lighter one, but it still made his reputation even worse. After all the trouble with the fraud charges, Jeff shifted his focus to something else: computers. He managed to land a job as an international consultant for the well-known company, IBM. Things seemed to take a turn for the better. He and his wife, Kim, had a son and moved to Dade City, Florida, they bought a beautiful house that was worth around $500,000. For a while, it seemed like Jeff was finally rebuilding his life. However, things weren't as perfect as they appeared on the surface. In 1997, Jeff and Kim filed for divorce, though they later reconciled and got back together. Despite all this, the shadow of the Pelley family murders still followed Jeff wherever he went, leaving him with a tarnished reputation that wouldn't go away. By the year 2000, the county prosecutor in Lakeville had changed. A new prosecutor named Chris Toth took over. He was determined to reopen cold cases, hoping to bring justice to victims like the Pelley family. He put together a fresh team of investigators and assigned Detective Craig Whitfield to take charge of the case. Craig's first step was to track down Jeff's two surviving sisters, Jack and Jessica. Jessica, the only surviving child of Dawn, who now goes by the name Jessie, had been disconnected from the rest of the family for years. She had spent a lot of time in foster care and struggled with substance abuse. By the time Craig interviewed her, Jessie had 2 children of her own, and she wasn't really in touch with her siblings anymore. During their conversation, Jessie revealed something shocking. She had once believed her father, Bob, was responsible for the murders. But as she got older, she found out that Jeff was actually being looked at as the prime suspect. Jessie remembered an unsettling conversation she had with Jeff when she was just 15 years old, 6 years after the murders. Jeff invited her to visit him and his new wife in Florida, and while she was there, he asked her, "Who do you think did it?" Jessie, still thinking it was their father, replied, "Your dad." To her surprise, Jeff simply said, "Okay." At the time, Jessie didn't think much of it, but looking back, she realized that Jeff might have asked that question because he was worried she might suspect him. After that, Craig interviewed Jacques, but she came with a lawyer by her side, worried that her words might be twisted or misinterpreted. Jacques was becoming more convinced that Jeff was the only possible suspect. The detectives were desperate to find solid proof to link him to the murders, so they started focusing on the laundry found at the crime scene. According to Craig Whitfield, the lead investigator on the case, he explained that a dark and pink striped shirt, a pair of blue jeans, and 2 white socks were found packed inside an Annis Finer Foods bag. Inside one of the pockets of the jeans, the FBI discovered 34 coins and $1, which added up to a total of $1.50, along with a receipt from Anna's grocery store. Craig believed that the jeans being found in the washer was suspicious and could be probable cause to arrest Jeff. He thought that Jeff had likely left the money and receipt in the jeans because he was distracted and in a rush to take them off, forgetting they were there. However, a pair of blue jeans was never found in the washing machine, only a shirt and socks. In fact, not a single detective or officer involved in the case ever said they personally handled a pair of blue jeans. Jeff was wearing blue jeans when he went to Lynette's house before prom, so it was strange that they weren't found. Another issue raised was that no officer ever went to Anna's grocery to confirm whether Jeff had been there. No one came forward to say they had personally seen him there. It seemed likely that the jeans were never washed and were not found in the washing machine with the shirt and socks. Instead, Jeff's clothes that were found in the back of his Mustang, including a Hawaiian shirt, may have been mixed with the other evidence. Craig then wrote up a probable cause statement for Jeff's arrest, and the newly elected prosecutor approved the warrant on August 10th of 2002. 13 years after Jeff's family was brutally taken from this world, he was arrested on 4 counts of first-degree murder. Craig, accompanied by a SWAT team, went to surround Jeff's house, but he wasn't home. Jeff, now 30 years old, was in Los Angeles after returning from a work trip to Australia. While at the airport, Customs detained him because a warrant for his arrest had been issued. Jeff was now going to fight a battle in court, and his apparent motive was that he wasn't allowed to go to prom. Jeff's sister Jacques and his wife Kim found a defense attorney named Alan Baum. Alan had never heard of the case before, but he agreed to take on Jeff's defense. His first move was to try to get Jeff bond, But this wasn't successful because Jeff was considered a flight risk. From 2003 to 2006, there were multiple delays in the trial. Alan kept trying to get the case thrown out, arguing that Jeff's right to a speedy trial had been violated. Jeff was eventually released on bond for most of 2005. In 2006, it was finally time for the trial. The lead prosecutor, Frank Schaefer, argued that Jeff was responsible for the murders, even though there was almost no concrete evidence linking him to the crime. Alan, on the other hand, argued that the police investigation had been flawed and they had focused too much on Jeff without considering other possibilities. Both of Jeff's remaining siblings, Jacques and Jesse, took the stand, and they had different things to say. Jessie testified that she had seen the 20-gauge shotgun hanging in her parents' bedroom before she left for her sleepover, but Jacques said that the shotgun had been removed the year before, along with all other firearms in the house. Jeff had mentioned this during his police interrogation as well, explaining that their father, Bob, decided to get rid of the firearms in the house because he didn't think Jeff was safe around them. Bob had given the guns to a man named Thomas Kebb. Thomas had stored a bag containing the shotgun, a rifle, and a pistol at his in-laws' house in their basement. The strange part was that investigators never spoke to Thomas or asked for the guns. Alan, the defense attorney, chose not to use Thomas as a witness because he believed that Jeff's mental state during that time might have influenced the jury's decision. On the other hand, the prosecution didn't want to call Thomas because they feared it would weaken their case against Jeff. Additionally, Jessie testified that her mom told her Jeff was going to Six Flags Great America, which Alan believed could raise doubts about Jeff's involvement, as it seemed like he had permission to go to prom. So why would he kill his family? Additionally, remember Dave, the man who first discovered the crime scene? Initially, he said the blood at the scene was still wet, implying the deaths had happened not long before. But when Dave testified in 2006, he switched his story, saying the blood was actually dry. There were also wet washcloths found nearby, and Alan, Jeff's lawyer, brought in an expert to show that washcloths would have been dry after about 12 hours. However, because the experiments were conducted in Arizona, the court didn't accept the results. Even more suspicious, no blood traces were found on Jeff's jeans, and Alan argued that Jeff wouldn't have had enough time to carry out the crime in under 15 minutes. After all, Jeff was just 17 years old at the time. Most teens wouldn't have been able to clean up a crime scene that quickly, especially since, according to everyone who knew him, Jeff didn't act strangely after those minutes. Another piece of strange evidence came from Bob's stomach, where they found popcorn kernels. Jacques, Jeff's biological sister, testified that Bob had a habit of eating popcorn every night between 7 and 8 p.m., usually after he put the girls to bed. In fact, a bowl of popcorn was found on Bob's desk, suggesting he had time to make and eat it before the crime took place. There were also 2 different types of shotgun shells found at the scene, plastic and paper, leading Alan to suggest that either 2 shooters or 2 different shotguns were involved. On top of that, the Mossberg 500 shotgun found in the Pelley house could only hold 5 rounds, but 6 shots were fired, casting more doubt on Jeff being the sole perpetrator. Now, Jeff never took the stand in his defense, as his lawyers believed it would be too risky. On July 22, 2006, he was convicted on all charges, and on October 17, he was sentenced to 160 years in prison. Some, like Jeff's stepsister Jessie, felt relieved by the conviction, but the story didn't end there. A new lawyer, Francis Watson, has been tirelessly working to prove that Jeff was wrongfully convicted. Watson has uncovered evidence that Jeff's original lawyer, Alan, didn't do his job properly during the trial. He believes the prosecution lied about the jeans, claiming they had been washed when they weren't, and that the lack of blood on Jeff supports his innocence. Watson also argues that Jeff's right to a speedy trial was violated, adding another layer to the case. A major new twist in the case involves Bob's connection to a man named Philip Hawley, who also had ties to Jeff when he left Lakeville. In fact, Philip may be the reason Bob and his family were tragically killed. Bob worked at Landmark Bank in Florida and had a close working relationship with Philip, who was Bob's supervisor. Philip was deeply involved in handling large financial transactions at the bank, and it turns out Bob discovered some serious financial fraud happening among his closest friends. This revelation left Bob terrified for his life. Pastor Michael Ross testified that Bob sought him out for advice about his fears, telling him he was worried for the safety of his family. Jacques Pelley, Bob's daughter, also remembered how her father's paranoia grew during this time. Things took a strange turn when a woman named Toni Beeler, who worked at United Church Directories, came forward. She reported that Bob had confided in her, expressing fears that people were after him. Sadly, this crucial testimony was never shared in the trial because, incredibly, the recordings of her interview with investigators were mysteriously lost. Adding to the intrigue, a man named Eric Dawson, who was connected to the same bank and financial dealings, was murdered in a manner very similar to Bob's. Eric had become friends with Philip Hawley, and after his disappearance, it was discovered that Philip had forged documents and engaged in various fraudulent activities, including misrepresenting financial transactions. Eric's body was found months after his disappearance, and authorities eventually uncovered a complex web of financial crimes tied to Philip and his family. Despite an extensive investigation, Philip was only convicted of forgery and theft, while his family members received little to no punishment. Even more suspicious was the fact that Philip Hawley was the beneficiary of a life insurance policy linked to a man named Harry Stewart, who was later exposed as a non-existent person. Bob Pelley had worked with Philip during this time, which raises serious questions about why Phil would have been the beneficiary of such a policy. This case is filled with many unanswered questions. Why were the guns never found? Why was Jeff not allowed to testify in his own defense? Could there have been multiple people involved in the crime? And why are there inconsistencies in the evidence, such as the claims about the washed jeans and missing shotguns? The new lawyer working on Jeff's case has uncovered significant flaws in the original investigation, suggesting that Jeff might have been wrongfully convicted. In 2024, despite all this new evidence and a push for a new trial, Jeff was denied for the fourth time. St. Joseph County Judge Stephanie Steele ruled that Jeff did not meet the burden of proof needed for a new trial.
The judge has denied Jeff Pelley's petition for a retrial. Pelley was convicted of killing his father, stepmother, and two stepsisters in Lakeville in 1989, so he could attend prom-related activities. A three-day hearing was held in March of 2022 to give Pelley's legal team a chance to present new evidence in the case.
When you think about it, if Jeff really were the killer, he would have to be one seriously skilled assassin. Imagine the level of expertise required for a 17-year-old boy to take out two adults and two children, clean up, and still have time to act like nothing happened, all within 15 minutes. And to top it off, he went to prom that evening, laughing and having fun with friends. The next morning, he was back at the park, seemingly unaffected. This case is incredibly wild and raises more questions than answers. It doesn't add up when you really break it down. But I want to hear what you think. Do you believe Jeff is innocent? Or do you think he's guilty? And what really happened on the night of the murders? If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.